Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us once again for this week's NACDA virtual programming series. I'm NACDA CEO Bob Vecchione, and I trust that you and your loved ones are remaining safe during this very, very critical time in our history. As we know, sports has long been regarded as a vehicle for bringing people together despite individual differences. This afternoon's conversation, titled Developing and Executing Diversity and Inclusion Plans, is an important and timely platform as our country and athletics departments continue to navigate the multitude of social injustices within our society. Whether your department is currently developing or enhancing a diversity and inclusion plan, or it is working to execute an already existing plan, today's session will discuss thoughts and suggestions as your peers around the country seek to implement initiatives and serve as a catalyst for change in our world. Today, we're joined by Sean Frazier, Associate VP and Director of Athletics at Northern Illinois University, Mike Aresco, Commissioner of the American Athletic Conference, and Renae Myles Payne, Senior Associate Athletics Director for Administration and Chief Diversity Officer at University of Miami. We look forward to learning about the components of their plans and how they effectively operationalize the plans to influence positive change in the departments and conferences. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We have allotted time for this at the end of the session. Further, NACDA is excited to host this session as the first educational component of an ongoing social justice in college athletics initiative. More information will be forthcoming in the next few days, but we look forward to providing educational opportunities across various platforms to facilitate open dialogue and inspire change and equality. Sean, take it away, and thanks to the three of you for participating in this very important session.
Good. Thanks a lot, Bob. I really appreciate it. Thanks to NACDA. Thanks for all the support in the platform. Very important, very timely. Obviously, diversity, racial issues, social consciousness have been on the minds of many of us who are leading athletic departments, who are engaged in activity with both the campus and the communities that we live in. But more important, there's a time for action. And this session, this webinar is about that. We've got some skilled professionals that are in the battle, that are practitioners, that are doing this work. And we wanted to make sure that this information got to you in a way where you can operationalize it and tailor it to your particular situation. I'm not going to go any further than that because we have a lot to get to. Limited time to talk about this particular topic. We'll have a chance to be able to do that offline, but I want to jump right into it. And Renae, if you could kind of share a little bit about what's going on in Miami, but specifically your experiences, and then we'll work through the line. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean, and thank you, NACDA, for the opportunity to have this important discussion today. So my perspective today is going to be from the practitioner standpoint. I'm in the weeds on a day-to-day basis, working day-to-day in diversity and inclusion within the athletic department at Miami. So I'm going to start with just giving a basic framework of developing a plan and executing a plan. And then at the end of our discussion, we'll go into some of the things that we're doing day to day at the University of Miami. So 3 suggestions for you. If you are that person that's recently been named the Chief Diversity Officer or elevated to that level, or you are the Athletic Diversity and Inclusion Officer that have that designation recently, 3 suggestions for you in just starting the process of developing a plan. Number 1, assess your current situation. Know where you are. What is the current temperature of your department? Do you have a department that's the level of respect for people of color is not, apropos, and you need to beef that up from an educational standpoint? Or do you have diversity, but you might not have inclusion? Understand what the temperament of your department is and work into the greatest need. What is the greatest need? And you talk to people who are already influential in the department with student athletes as well as staff. So assess your current situation. And then what is your approach to developing the plan itself? So at Miami, the approach that we used was kind of like the coaches planning for a game on Saturday to beat that team. And so our deal was, we're the coaches, myself, Sherelle Jackson, Jen Strawley, and Felicia Tunay. We got together as a coaching staff per se, and decided, again, what we're trying to beat is injustice, inequality, and ignorance within the department, to win at diversity and inclusion, to be that department that's leading the way in diversity and inclusion. So we approached it from like a coach would approach a game plan. How do you sit down and put that together, knowing what the team that you're trying to defeat, what you want to do, and don't write a plan. So nobody has time for this theoretical 20-page document that's going to sit on the shelf like some people's strategic plan. Write something that's very instructional and actionable with visible results. That's what people want to see. Not that, not your theory on diversity and inclusion. What exactly are you doing on a day-to-day basis? So don't just write a plan, write an instruction manual almost is what I would suggest. And then your alignment with leadership. Hopefully you've already met with your athletic director and gotten the expectations from him or her. What do they want to see in the department? And make certain that you know the culture of your department. What are you doing that is different from campus? So don't do something that's totally out in left field from what they're doing already on campus. Talk to your people on campus from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and make sure that what you're doing within the department is aligning with what they're doing on the broader campus. So those 3 suggestions for developing. Now in the execution, 2 points. Your aptitude. If you know you are not well-versed in this space, hire someone, or somebody is a phone call away or a Google search away to get help and resources. Don't try to handle this on your own. I've been working in this area since 2011. So actually, since I started my dissertation in 2005, but 2011 is when I actually started doing the actual work with athletic departments. So if you know you are not the practitioner or have the aptitude to do this work, make sure you get help in doing this. Don't just try to set off and do it on your own. And then finally, the attitude in executing the plan. You cannot do this work from a space of frustration and anger. You must be understanding. You must have empathy and compassion for people. So your attitude will determine the altitude that your department goes to in working in diversity and inclusion. If you're frustrated, again, we all are. We have some, we're angry, we're frustrated from what is happening in the current climate. But my suggestion is when you're doing the actual work with your staff and your student athletes, that doesn't come off. You need to have empathy and compassion if you're going to be effective in the plan. So we'll talk about later some of the things that we're doing specifically at the University of Miami. But assess your current situation, approach, develop your plan and the approach that you're going to use, align with your leadership, know what they want to see, then executing your aptitude. If you're not able to do the work, hire someone or get assistance in doing it, and then make sure you have the right attitude in executing the plan.
Great, fantastic. And as you can see, all different processes, they all need to arrive in one location, which is, again, implementation, development, and execution. And that's very well done. Just a couple of pieces just to frame that component before we go into Mike, is the fact that there are some baseline techniques, a climate survey. You might have heard some of these particular issues. You might be in different spaces. You might have already developed a climate survey, do that on an annual basis, and then you already have a strategic framework already developed. I would say, just in the space of where we are at NIU, we have that. But because of the events that have happened recently with George Floyd and the recent social consciousness that's going on right now, we had to pivot and we had to go more social action around the implementation process. So there's different levels of where you are, and Renae hit it right on the head. Again, if we don't feel that we have all of the components well-versed in some of the current teaching, it's fine to be able to do some outreach. And some of that outreach might be on your campus, chief diversity officer, community involvement. These are all pieces, and we'll talk further as we kind of go through the process. But again, it's important to know that the development and the execution is going to be key. So Mike, having said that, your experiences, where you're currently sitting at from a leadership standpoint, if you could share some of that with us.
Thank you, Sean. And as a commissioner, I come at it from a different place, but I don't think ultimately that we've done enough, that, we need to do more. I think we need to structure what we're doing more. In 2019, we got the report card, from the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport at the University of Central Florida, and that's Richard Lapchick's organization. And the report card showed that for the NCAA and its member institutions, in terms of gender hiring practices, racial hiring practices, college sports received a B for racial hiring practices, not good enough. We should obviously be receiving an A. College sport received only a C+ for gender hiring, and the combined grade was a C+. So I don't think ultimately we're doing enough. But having said that, what I've tried to do with our schools is reach out and determine best practices. We also have, and I can talk about this later, as you mentioned, John, what our conference has done over the years, because we've had a very successful 2-year minority internship that has generated some terrific people who might not have had an opportunity to, and they've been hired. We've hired some of them, and they've also gone on to other terrific jobs. But in terms of the institutional approach, I think Renee's right. You have to assess your current situation. You have to find out which policies are part of your problem. If you're not, attracting, diversity in gender and in race, what are your issues, and what's causing you to fall short? I think it requires constant monitoring, and you need to understand, what your goals are here. We also have to focus on policies that encourage retention as well as recruitment, of minorities and of women. In terms of we have internships. I think internships are a really, really good way to cultivate really talented people who might not have an opportunity otherwise. We have to deepen our searches. We have to make sure that search committees are composed of a diverse group of people and they have diverse networks, because you've got to be able to find people, and some people just aren't aware of the opportunities. For example, we've reached out to key people at the NCAA and elsewhere to find, really good candidates. Candidates have to have an awareness of job openings. So we're trying to educate, our students and our student athletes to be aware of what opportunities might be out there. And we challenge, in the conference, and I know our schools do, we challenge the internal, search committees to come up with a diverse pool, and there are ways, obviously, of doing that. And you need to make these connections. So those are the kinds of things that we're focused on. Our Racial Equality Action Group, which we've just set up, and it's an important initiative, and I don't want to, this isn't the focus of the webinar today, but we're listening to our student athletes, and we're trying to determine a lot of the issues surrounding race relations. It's the most important thing we've done, and we're going to continue to do it. But as part of that, we realize that we've got to take a new look at our diversity and inclusion protocols. And we've talked to our coaches. This involves administrators and coaches. Too, we have 6 of our 11 basketball coaches are minority coaches, but there's a lot of work to be done in that area. What about assistant coaches? What about people who want to come up through various paths? The other issue is that if you really, look at the situation right now, you want people, minorities to have an opportunity in the boardroom, to get to the top. And how do you do that? And what are the obstacles? So that group is going to be a very important group in terms of dealing with our other schools and determining what we're doing. Our schools have, as you know, chief diversity officers. They're doing much more. I have some case studies that I can share, not necessarily do it in this segment, Sean, but case studies of some schools that have gotten A's, in what they're doing, Cincinnati and UCF. UCF, of course, being associated with, the Institute. So again, those are the kinds of things that we're focused on right now. And as a conference, we have done some things that I can talk about after when we get into the issue of case studies. But there's a lot more work to do, Sean.
Yep, you got it. I appreciate it, Mike, and that's a good little setup. So we'll try to do a little speed round here. Not necessarily too much speed round. I don't want to be too not be comprehensive, but I want to talk. Let's get into the weeds a little bit. Let's get into the little weeds. I know we have a number of folks that are trying to pick up some different tips. So going back to what I just said about pivoting a bit. We here at NIU, what we did is, we had a plan, just like most of us do. A lot of this has been formulated during the course of my career. I have had the opportunity to be at some different places, both public and private, what works for different places and different situations, obviously. One of the things that putting a lot of it together, I have to give kudos to University of Wisconsin, put together the first kind of coordination or shared agenda process called the Diversity Integration Group, or DIG for short. Again, digging for diversity was kind of a concept that we used to talk a lot about. Took that concept to NIU and developed it into an award-winning set of theory, practice, and action. And some of the things that we had with that group, what makes it novel is that it wasn't just an athletics group, it was an institutional group. It was a community-based group. So the programs and different things that we saw, and we had a part of the strategic planning process, was to make sure we were inclusive of both campus, community, and quite frankly, regional and national, being the fact of our alumni base was so close to our institution. So DIG, having these issues that have just happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many different things, quite frankly, that rose the student voice to a level that was significant and still significant. We had to pivot. So just like many of us, okay, we've got this issue, we have this crisis, we need to continue our level of conversation and discourse around the social consciousness as well as the issues of race. We actually put together a social justice education plan. And Courtney Vincent is my senior associate athletic director. She's over a number of our programs, but she also is quarterbacking our DIG group, and shout out to her and her efforts. We actually put this, and you can go to niuathletics.com. We actually have a press kit that's out, and this plan is there for you. And I definitely would tell you to take a look at it. But some of the things we talked about was educating, obviously, the issue at hand, which was obviously what happened in Minneapolis and the situation around that. Then having conversations and getting into the weeds, things like microaggressions, things like how do we bridge this conversation, not necessarily for the minority, but for the majority, for all, because a lot of this is a human rights issue. Yes, Black and brown people are definitely being affected, and there's no question about that. But I think all of us, we have a voice, we have a responsibility and a commitment to be a connector. So some of the discussions around that was to take individual teams, football, track and field, soccer, men's basketball, all of our programs having individual conversations because very passionate about what's happening. People were afraid, people are afraid. People are disgusted by us continuing to having these levels of conversations, but necessary. There's a lot of mental health issues that were going in play because, again, not only were we dealing with race relations, we're dealing with COVID-19 and being shut in and shut down. So all this stuff was kind of manifesting, and this social justice plan, education plan, needed to be vetted, and it needed to be connected across campus and the community for it to work. I can't stress more. Doing things in a vacuum, doing things by yourself will not work because our students are going to be heavily involved in campus and community functions. It needs to be a collaborative effort. So that was a key component of us pivoting to this social action plan. So again, teams, obviously dealing with Black and brown student athletes specifically who had significant issues of trust and confusion around this issue. So again, direct trainings for them. Focusing on all student athlete training, because again, no one wanted to be segregated away from the conversation, but their issues were somewhat different based on where they were coming from. We have urban students, we have students from the rural environment. So having that level of conversation and then bringing people together with skilled facilitators that can be able to answer some of those questions, having clinicians around the mental health side of the plan. So all those pieces are rolled into the actual plan itself. And then, quite frankly, dispelling certain things that are myths, things that are not true, things that are perceived. But again, perception is reality. So having education around these issues are important. Give you the microaggressions example, and I'll then ask Renae to kind of go into the weeds a little bit at Miami. Microaggressions. One of the things, I hosted a town hall for our staff specifically. And it's one of the things that, quite frankly, are used a lot. And there's a whole listing of microaggressions. You can Google microaggressions, and I'm quite sure you'll see some great authors that are out there that will talk a little bit about it. But, things like, I don't see race. I treat everybody the same. Those are microaggressions. Those are things that are examples of marginalization. And I say that because if you don't see race and you treat everybody the same, you don't see me. I see you, regardless of your race, color, creed, disability. It's important to understand you frame that. You didn't have probably an intentional viewpoint to marginalize, but these are microaggressions that are a part of the systemic racism that we currently deal with. And we have to be understanding how we say it, because people have been alerted to these issues now, very educated. Our student athletes are very heightened interested in what goes on right now. There's not going to be one hire, one program, one sport program that's not going to be thinking about these issues moving forward. This is not going away. We just have to educate ourselves at a level where we can be great ambassadors of why it works. Sport has been doing that since the dawn of time, bringing people together. So I'll halt right there because I threw a lot out there. But again, the real issue is, if you don't have a plan and you're developing a plan, obviously there's baseline issues that you should be considering in that development. But then the execution needs to be collaborative. It needs to be a part of a shared agenda across campus and the community to truly be effective. So don't treat it like necessarily a crisis management where we have to triage it. It needs to be a long-term effect. So it's institutionalized and departmental wide. So it's not an add-on. Generally, when things are added on, they're the first thing that get cut off, okay, in my estimation, but I'm an old head relative to operational programs. So if you have, as a part of it systemically throughout your department and throughout your institution, it's much harder to get rid of because it's part of the fabric of the operation. So said a lot there. We'll be glad to ask some questions, but Renae, can you take us through Miami and maybe get in the weeds about some of the formations and some of the things that you're doing relative to what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. So, and that was a great segment that you just talked through. So first of all, understand that diversity and inclusion is a big umbrella. And what we're dealing with now, because this is what's in front of us so heavily, is the race and ethnicity piece within diversity and inclusion. So I want to make sure that's clear. Diversity and inclusion itself is this big umbrella. And race and ethnicity is the thing that has gotten everybody talking and wants some action happening, because the students are talking about it and now staff are talking about it. So we didn't have a plan at Miami. So for those that, are on the call who are like, well, we don't have a plan, that's fine, that's okay. This is your time. This is the moment that you develop it. I personally already came into the University of Miami with diversity and inclusion experience. Plus it was a part of my job description. So this wasn't something that was created from what was happening in the current climate. I came in with that piece as a part of my job. So I knew at some point that we would be creating a plan or a movement within the department on this, but the climate said, move faster. And so we had no choice but to move faster. So After the student athletes gave their piece and had the things that they wanted to say to us as staff, we listened to them. We let them talk to us. So if you haven't had that opportunity yet to get your student athletes on a call to allow them to talk through the things that they're thinking about, and you just listen as a staff, I would encourage you to do that. And then secondly, we needed an opportunity for our staff to talk and give their thoughts of what was happening. So we created our immediate plan. This is our immediate plan because we have an intermediate plan and we have a continuous plan. Our immediate plan was to create a 9-week educational process for all of our staff. It's highly encouraged. We did not require it, but we highly encourage it. And I'm happy to report that 135 staff members out of 206 full-time staff members are participating in a 9-week process at the University of Miami. It's been unreal. It's been great. It's something that I've used since 2011. It's a documentary called Race, The Power of an Illusion. Again, I'm versed in doing the work. So you need to be versed in doing the work. And I have a great partner, Dr. Felicia Tunay, who's also a professor at the University of Miami, whose research is in social justice and race, but she's also a learning specialist within the athletic department. So you have tools already possibly in your space to help you do this work. So we've started that. We're in week 3. And we have six weeks to go. But it's been amazing, the progress that we've made in conversations with each other. You get to know so much about your colleague that you just didn't know. And there are conversations that some of us disagree with reverse discrimination. Some of us disagree with, reverse affirmative action. Why is that necessary? And those discussions are happening within these groups. And it's just amazing. So that was our immediate plan, to do that for our staff. And then we have a parallel path for the student athletes. They're doing the same thing through their Hurricane 101 orientation. They get the diversity inclusion pieces within that. And then when school starts, we'll have some internal things with them that we'll do in the evening. Of course, they have to do things in the evening with them that we'll work through from an educational standpoint. So that was the immediate. And then the continuous, the intermediate pieces are, after we finish our educational model, we'll go to specific sessions, just like Sean mentioned, microaggressions. We'll talk about the use of the N-word, the locker room in general for different teams, specifically football, how the word is used. What kind of words are used in the locker room in general, just not from a race standpoint, but we'll get into a lot of that too in discussions with different teams. Hey, this is one people ask all the time, Black women in their hair. We're going to have the discussion because it's out there. People have always wanted to talk about it and they haven't had a space. That's why I encourage, if you're doing the work, to have to be empathetic and compassionate, because you're going to get questions from people that you wouldn't often, want to answer. But that's the work that we're doing, and that's the atmosphere that we're in. And then our continuous work is with looking at our hiring practices. What do our policies look like? When I was at Winthrop, we went from 3% diversity within the department to 21% in 3 years. Won awards for it and everything. Did an NCAA case study and everything. Why? Because there was a person of influence in a position that said, this is how we're going to do it. I was given the authority to do it, and it worked. It can be done. So you don't have to say, how do we hire more minorities? Or how do we affect change within this space? If the person that's in the position, chief diversity officer or athletic diversity and inclusion designation, have that designation, understand that you must have autonomy and authority to do your job. But you got to get that from the athletic director. You don't own that. You must get that from the athletic director first, and then you can move forward in doing your job. So reviewing the hiring practices, having an audit of your diversity and inclusion plan. Someone outside of your space in athletics auditing what you guys are doing on a day-to-day basis. And is it, and is it working? And I act like an ombudsman within our athletic department. That's someone who can kind of mediate situations within the department, hopefully before they get to an HR situation or anything like that. That's part of what I do on a day-to-day basis, and the things that we're doing in the weeds at Miami. So, but first, you got to have an immediate reaction, and our immediate reaction was educational.
Great, Renae. That's great stuff. That's fantastic. Mike, you're up. Let's get in the weeds a little bit.
Sean, there's a lot there. Incredible amount what you and Renae have talked about. And I think what I take away is there has to be a holistic approach to this. I think you talked about that, Sean, and Renae's talking about the same kinds of things. It's not just, okay, let's hire people, and one of the things when we talk about, the title is diversity and inclusion as well. Inclusion also means development. It means when you have, good people, you want to develop them. And that means understanding what they need, what their goals are as people, and what you can do to help them. That's critical. The other thing you mentioned, Sean, you alluded to it, action. When we set up the Racial Equality Action Group, it was appropriate to make thoughtful statements in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy. But we realized that what's the point of making a thoughtful statement if you don't do anything afterward? And so action became the key. That's why we called it an action group. We also wanted to call it racial equality because we wanted something uplifting, in the message. We're working now on a mission statement, and also, we're thinking about calling our program American Voices, because we want to listen to voices. We want to listen to our student athletes. We had everybody talk on our committee. Everybody has a committee. Conferences have set up committees, and they talked about their experiences. Derek Gregg, our chair, who, played, was an African-American football player at Vanderbilt, grew up in Alabama. He talked about experiences that we can't, many of us couldn't relate to. And to hear those experiences, it creates a certain empathy that maybe, you didn't necessarily have before. The point is, though, that all ties into hiring. It all ties into promotion. It all ties in to whether we're ultimately going to have enough, the kind of diversity that we really are proud of. And that leads to nuts and bolts. I think the nuts and bolts of this follow what you and Renae were talking about, because you have to have a climate, a culture that's going to promote this. And if not, you're not going to get anywhere. And now tonight we have our first listening session with student athletes, and we're going to have a number of these. And we had our coaches identify student athletes who were, more committed and more determined, and we're going to have everybody eventually. But that's going to be very important, because it's going to. We also want to find out what their goals are and how we can help their goals. Now, just a couple of quick things. Tulane, for example, they allot time during all staff meetings to discuss, diversity and inclusion. They have, they do social justice training all year, which is absolutely critical. Cincinnati, for example, okay, they realize in order to have, a good, group of women's coaches, they needed to do something about childcare. Might be something we don't think about, but they looked at their childcare policy and said, this is going to be instrumental in recruiting and retaining really good, female coaches. They also, ensure that the committees, the search committees are diverse. They also want to identify obviously qualified candidates, and there are plenty, and they may not know that there are opportunities out there. In addition, we've got some other schools that are working in this area, and the whole notion is that you have to make connections, and you have to have an overall strategy. Now, UCF has been a leader in this. They have a great record, and they work with the institute that Richard Lapchick runs. And we're going to do more of that. We as a conference, Sean, need to work with Richard, more than we have in the past. We're aware of what he's doing. We've been quite conscious of it, but we need to do more of that. And, I could get into all the different things we do, such as, grant programs to try to recruit senior women administrators, minority grant programs that our conference has, that our schools have, the internships I talked about, which are very valuable. But in the end, I think there's just got to be a better racial and gender understanding among everyone. And I don't want that to sound like just a cliche, because it's real. You know, the George Floyd tragedy sparked a lot of really valuable thought that, frankly, we hadn't been engaged in enough. You know, and you alluded to it, Renae alluded to it. And unless, one last thing I'll mention in this segment is we have an academic consortium which has been sponsoring research papers, our conference, and it's funded by our universities. Our presidents support it, NADs. And basically, we've decided to get additional funding, and we've focused on mental health of student athletes because that's such a huge area. We were one of the, years ago, we realized that it's one thing to have physically healthy student athletes, but the mental health issues are really significant and often hidden. And we didn't want any stigma associated with people seeking help if they did have, you know, any mental or emotional issues. And we've done a lot of valuable research, and we've had doctors working on this as well. We're going to now also commission papers to get to the roots of racial inequality, to find out what the real issues are. And diversity and inclusion will certainly be part of this. But we think that education is obviously critical. There's only so much you can do, you know, and you hope you can change people's attitudes, what's in their heart, but there's only so much you can do, but you can educate. And that's what the academic consortium is now going to focus on. So I think I agree with you completely. And Renae, it's a holistic thing. And, you know, that term, I guess, can be, you know, interpreted a lot of different ways, but you really have to have a broad array of things that you're doing to create a culture so that ultimately you'll find that you do have more minority opportunity, more opportunities for women, more opportunities for people of color who just haven't had those opportunities in the past.
Well said, Mike. I appreciate it. You've talked about the leadership component. You've talked about some of the components associated with the number of institutions. You talk about the accountability. That's what you're talking about. Part of this is, as we kind of go back, and we'll have a chance to do a little lightning rod before we do some Q&A here. But a lot of this is about leading, you know, from the seat that you're in. Okay. I think a lot of times people take a look at these issues, and, you know, they're highly contentious. Let's just call it what it is. Race in America, highly contentious. And it's something that, again, you know, some people do shy away. I think right now, the responsibility that we have as practitioners, folks who are on the front line, folks that are in the education business, higher education, it's so important to be able to have an action-oriented, forward-thinking approach to what we're doing. And I think that the days of, okay, that only applies to this particular group, or that only applies to that particular group, are gone. I'm quite sure the folks that are on this webinar, or maybe the choir, as I would say, the folks that are, you know, that are wanting to gain more education, but probably have some idea about what's happening. I would tell you that not being tone deaf to the voice of the student and the staff that is in the minority. Black and brown, obviously minority classification, protected class. It's very important that you engage this at this time. I can't imagine, I just could not imagine a board of regent, board of trustee, president, chancellor hiring anyone that has not demonstrated some capacity of leadership in this area of race relations at this moment, at this time. And that's just more of a friendly advice from me to you, is that it's very important that you engage this activity, not as something that, you know, you have to do, that you must do. It's a part of the fabric of who we are as higher education professionals. And I think that once that goes along, and, you know, I, as a young administrator, you know, ramming down diversity initiatives or things that are, you know, very contentious, very painful on both sides, both as the practitioner as well as ones who are receiving the information. So creating an environment that's inviting, that it's safe for both, because I think that's the part of the plans. The plans do not work if folks are coming in there right away thinking, okay, I'm going to get beat upside the head on these particular issues. You're not going to get the same receptiveness around understanding that this is so important that we need to make it an educational environment for all, not just the students, the staff, the community. And although it's contentious, I'm not going to be tone deaf to understand that race in America is contentious. It is a mandatory process by which we can work together and create a shared agenda. So leading from the chair that you're in, you don't have to be the AD, you don't have to be the president of the institution, you don't have to be the janitor, you don't have to be the guy who cuts on the light, turns off the light. The bottom line is that you can make a difference by virtue of exhibiting and demonstrating what's right and what you have learned. And if you take that posture in your education, in your plan, in talking about these complex issues, and they're very complex, but if you do that and say, hey, I have a voice, I see myself in the plan, I understand how this is going to make a difference for the young people I serve and for the staff that I serve and for my community. That empowerment is going to trickle, and that will transcend the racial component. There will be differences. I'm from XYZ environment, you're from that environment, and we need to come together. Sport is going to bridge that. It's from the dawn of time, we've had sport being that equalizer, that bringing people together. Now it's about understanding the dynamics about race in America and race in sport and how we can then come together. So it's not shocking. So we don't sit back and say, I really don't get that. Why did that happen? And I think that's important that as an institution of higher learning, that it starts with that education. It's dispelling those myths. It's tackling those microaggressions. It's understanding why this is going to make the difference for all of us outside the boundaries of the institution. Understanding for passage in citizenship, we need to have this education and these core competencies. We need to understand that and being culturally competent. And this is very important for us to be able to move the agenda. So we're coming at the 12:42, or that's my central time, excuse me. We're coming down to the point. I'd like to just pose, just one thing, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience that could possibly help out in your individual plans. But the question I'll pose is that what's one of the things that you feel for this issue of diversity and inclusion that's been helpful and that would help others? I know you have a laundry list of it, but Renae, maybe one thing that this needs to happen that's worked for you at Miami, and we'll do the same thing with Mike, and then we'll come back for some questions. Renae?
I guess one thing that has worked is being empathetic, being open to listening to the different thoughts. Again, if you're talking to coaches and staff who believe in reverse discrimination, that'll just give you that piece. I've had a discussion with a coach who talked thoroughly to me about him being white and not getting a job and being told that it was because he wasn't the right color. Mm. And I'm looking at him, I said, Coach, that happened to me all the time. That's my lived experience. But us being able to have that open dialogue about the differences that we see, or people not for the first time believing that race isn't real. Mm. Always having thought that. So the one thing that has been helpful for me is being open and having these very thoughtful, empathetic conversations with people who have a different view than I do. Not saying you're going to change their behavior or your thought process, but at least you're in a space where you can hear each other. So that's been helpful for me.
That's great. That's great advice. Fantastic. Mike, what's been helpful for you? What's worked for you?
Sean, I think, again, I come back to this idea of action. You have to put your words into action. It's very good to, and I think it's important to articulate things well, because words have meaning. And that's why, as I alluded to, the statements in the wake of George Floyd were very important. But for example, at Tulane, they've established a diversity council, of student athletes. And they hold, their fellow students and staff members accountable, and their goal, obviously, dismantle racism within collegiate athletics, within higher education, within the community. we're going to reach out to police departments in the communities. And we're hoping to get some police chiefs who are minority police chiefs to be advisors to our committee with our racial equality group, because we think it's really important to reach out to the community. But the idea, Temple has formed a group called Owls for Justice. It's a student-led social justice and reform group. And it not only responds to perceived and real injustices, but they also provide resources to educate student athletes and staff and others. I think the education component is extremely important. And again, I really want to try to avoid bromides and cliches, but the idea that student athletes, we want them to speak up now, and they're speaking up more than ever before, and that's healthy. It's extremely healthy. And if they do, then they're going to want to be more involved as they go forward. And I think they're going to want to be more involved in leadership positions. And then you get to, okay, well, how do you then effectuate that? And in our case, again, you have to challenge your internal search committees to make sure that they come up with diverse pools of candidates. Okay, you've got to do that. That's where it starts. Or you've got to have internship programs. Internships are very valuable. We all know that. They've been dismantled a lot because of, the requirements for internships. And ours are paid internships. And if you do that kind of thing, or you get academic credit, you can do those things. But the other thing is there has to be awareness of what is available out there. And then there has to be, again, encouragement about what career you're going to pursue. It's not just getting a job. It's what you can become and what you can do down the road. So I think, in the larger scheme of things, I would just argue that you've got to have the dialogue. You've got to, and our schools are doing that. I'm proud of what our schools are doing. I haven't mentioned all of them. Obviously, I can't mention all of them, but I'm mentioning some that have some unique attributes. But, all around college sports now, there's a dialogue going on, but it's got to continue. If it stops, and that's why our racial equality group is, and I think that's going to be true, what, Kevin Warren has done at the Big Ten with his anti-racism group. Those things I think are going to continue for the long term. These have to be embedded in what we're doing. We can't just say, we're only going to do it for this year. We're going to do PSAs throughout our, if we play at all this year, of course. But if we do, we're going to reach millions of people with the public service announcements, and they're going to be thoughtful, and they're going to be, student athletes talking. You remember the Centennial Minutes? Well, how many of us really understand the history of race relations? We have University of Memphis, which is obviously been tragic history there, but also some good things. And Memphis now has a national museum, of civil rights. And we're going to reach out to that museum and to, the people who run the museum. And that is going to become part of, I think, curriculum. That's the last thing I'm going to mention. I think you're going to see a lot more of the issues that you talked about, Sean, that Renae's talked about, that everybody on the call is concerned about, becoming part of the curriculum at various universities and high schools. There hasn't been a lot of that. Do people know who, obviously Booker T. Washington was, right? Do they know who Frederick Douglass was? An incredible story. Do they know what happened? Do we know what Martin Luther King did and said? Do we know what Maya Angelou has done in the area of literature? Those are the kinds of things now that I think there's a renewed focus on that, and that's going to be a very good thing long term.
Good. Well, Katie, I think that we're time for some questions out there. I know that we've done a good job of kind of formatting the approach, but I'm quite sure there's some questions out there. If you could supply them, and then we can try to answer them as we go. How about that?
Absolutely, Sean. Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts and suggestions today. Just a reminder to those that are joining us on Zoom, if you do have a question, please go ahead and submit that in the Q&A feature of your Zoom toolbar. The first question, Renae, was directed specifically towards you, but certainly anybody can answer this. You talked about in the development of your plan, the possibility of bringing an outside individual in to assist with the development of the components of your plan. How do you suggest vetting those outside individuals to discern that they are a subject matter expert, and what credentials should administrators look for in soliciting the assistance of an individual of that status?
Yeah, I would use, and I mean, we work in sports, so I'm sorry if I keep using these different sport analogies, but I would vet them the same way, a coach recruits an athlete. You know what you're looking for, the position that you're looking for. You've already assessed your situation. You know what the climate is, and you know where you want to go. So I would make certain that the person that you're looking at can meet that, and they can be there not just one time. I'm not talking about just a speaker, because speakers are good, but they leave. And then you're kind of left with what to do next. So this is more so of someone, almost a consultant or a partner, that works alongside you in the department to get things done. And so, I don't want to call names, but I would say this. MOA is working through vetting some people who we think that can help, move these things forward. And if you can reach out to me directly, I can help you, with some names of some people you can reach out to. But credential wise, what is their work in the space been, and how long has it been? Because here's the thing, there are a lot of places cropping up now, trying to get their foot in the door to do this work. And those of us who've been in this space for a while, are side eyeing them. I'm just going to say it, period. So make sure that you check and see how long have they been involved in this work. How long have they done any research that you can point to in this work, and then reach out to me directly or anyone in the MOA executives team, and we can help you determine, based on what you know about your department, some people who could work with you hand in hand.
Good. Very good. Very good thoughts.
Great. Sean, did you have something to add to that? I'm
No,
sorry, go ahead.
I did. I think she handled it quite well. I'm good with that. Mike,
Our next.
I'm sorry, Mike, did you want to comment on anything?
Well said. I mean, I think, again, I think those are points that people have to take seriously. And again, this is a complex, you said it, Sean, this is a complex area. There's just a lot to discuss and a lot to analyze. And I think, Renae's also on the front lines, and so consequently it's a combination of practical advice, but it's also, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your ultimate goals? And I thought she expressed it extremely well.
Good. Yeah, Katie.
Okay, well, on that's a good segue. Our next question is related to conversations. So we know that the topics surrounding diversity and inclusion can sometimes be difficult conversations to have. The question that we have here, we have coaches that are struggling to facilitate conversation about race relations and social justice with their own teams because they themselves are a non-minority individual and part of an older generation. What resources or suggestions might you have for facilitating those conversations?
So I'll take a little bit of that. I'm quite sure Renae can comment, and same thing with Mike. But that's the typical front line and what we've all been thrusted into. I wouldn't say recently. I think this has been an ongoing thing that we've been dealing with. I don't want to say that just because of George Floyd and the incident and issues that we've had. That's probably the most recent issue. But I would say the first thing is that, we talked a bit about our plan. That was some of the things we had to pivot at NIU about was, okay, we need to have that conversation. We need to have it very direct. Students are asking for action. They're asking for more conversation. So part of that is that the instruction, giving the education to our coaches about these issues, because many of the coaches have had some similar backgrounds and some have not, depending on where they've come from, where they've been, and how educated, because we always have to standardize training around diversity and inclusion when they're onboarded. But part of the process now is about, this is a tough conversation. And it looks a little different than the South Side of Chicago versus somebody whose experiences maybe be someplace that's not the South Side of Chicago. I'll just put it that way. So part of that is just, making sure that the coach is educated about cultural competency, issues. Kind of go back to my microaggressions piece. There might be some philosophical differences. So they're not put into a situation where they're trying to have a conversation and they do more damage than good. The other one is that this is where that professional could be someone across campus. It could be somebody with that skill set to aid in that conversation. Okay. I don't like typically having a coach that doesn't feel comfortable with these conversations to facilitate a conversation because it needs to happen because the student athletes are asking for it. I think that creates a lot of issues. Because of my background, I do have a bit of an advantage because I can lead and step in, but I'm also the boss's boss, right? So there's some levels that I can't even jump into because I don't want it to be uncomfortable for the coach. So that's where that paraprofessional, that person cross campus, maybe that hired gun, that's teaming up with you to have a process that gives clarity about what it is. So that's one way of handling it. The other area is to basically talk about this as a part of what you're currently doing, kind of that instead of adding on, we've pivoted. We've had the diversity integration group, and then we pivoted to the social justice education. But a lot of this stems back to everything that we do. We talked about diversity and inclusion. Well, how do we integrate it in everything that we do? Mike talked about that there's meetings, and in the meetings, we bring it up. Okay. It's not like, okay, today we have to bring it up. No, this is a part of the daily interactions, the daily integration of the conversations that are going on. And I think it's so important that the coach, as well as the student athlete, so, I have a captain's council on top of my student athlete advisory committee, having those conversations a lot. So it's not a surprise to have that conversation when it comes up. Now, we might have crisis issues and things that might happen like George Floyd, but then you integrate it in your current structure. So as you're developing your plans should be a part of everything that you do. And again, it doesn't have to manifest in diversity and inclusion. It could be a current event. It could be other things that create a certain level of competency with the coach. So when he or she has to have that conversation, it's not the first time we're dealing with from a crisis standpoint. So that's my perspective on that. Maybe Mike, Renae, maybe you can clean up.
Oh, that was well said.
Yeah, it was. And Sean, I think that's what, the groups that have been formed in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy, the hope is that these won't be separate groups that are doing something that is separate from what the campuses are doing. We're trying to make sure that this is all combined with what the campuses are doing, that we're all on the same page. And so consequently, what you're really talking, facilitating the conversations is really critical. You also said, Sean, students want action. They do. It's clear now that you saw what, at the University of Texas, there's some things that are now being done that are really going to be, long-term positives and really positives for race relations too, because, every school, has to look at these things. Coaches, I think coaches are more eager than they've ever been to understand, because I think, a lot of them probably were taken a bit, by surprise. They just didn't realize, well, there's some of these issues were there, and they maybe hadn't really focused on them. Now, in our case, Kelvin Sampson, of course, who is one of the great coaches and one of the great people, he's been instrumental. He's been kind of a point person for, and I don't know if it's not really necessarily a formal group yet, but Coaches versus Racism, and coaches, I think, want to be more involved. When we set up our equality group, coaches wanted to be involved, and coaches called us saying, I'd like to be involved, and not just minority coaches. It was all coaches that, had a real interest in this, because you have to, it's part of our fabric. And the final thing is, our coaches have made statements by groups. They've gotten together, like the soccer coaches, the football coaches, and they made their own statements, and they've gotten together. I think that kind of collaboration is really critical. And one thing that happened, for example, at Temple, what they did with their Owls for Justice, reached out to different groups across campus and different groups in the community. And what ultimately resulted too is that they started planning for mandatory diversity and inclusion training, which is critical too. And it's something that, frankly, I think we're going to see the dialogue among coaches and players reach greater heights in the future because, one, it has to, and two, it's going to be healthy for everyone. I don't think there's any question about it.
Mike, I appreciate it. You're going to send us out here. Renae, Mike, thank you so much for your adding to this this very important conversation, your experience, your leadership. We deeply appreciate this. And Bob, thank you. NACDA's leadership in this has been continuous. I really appreciate that, and really appreciate the fact that we had this platform to talk. If there's anything that we can do to help continue the conversation, feel free to message me directly, call, write, email. I'll do the best I can. Best of luck as you kind of pursue this. Please know this is an important issue and issues, and anything that we can do to further that conversation, we'll be there for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Bob. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Bob, but thank you, Sean. That was a great job moderating, and thank you for your help leading up to this. Bob, thank you for including us, and Renae, terrific, absolutely terrific, and Katie, thank you, Katie, for obviously doing so much work behind the scenes. Thank you. Bob, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Great, thanks, Mike. Well, again, to Mike and Sean and Renae, I mean, really a cross-section of leadership here with Renae being the practitioner, focusing on being empathetic and listening. Great virtue there. Mike, it's really unique to have a commissioner's perspective, especially sitting in your chair when your main focus is on action. There's been a lot of talk through the years. Let's do something, and you're really taking that by the horn. Sean, your DIG program, including all facets of campus and community, huge, and obviously your enthusiasm is contagious. So thank you for your enthusiasm. Thank you for your passion. NACDA is going to continue this, guys. Our social justice in college athletics initiative, we're going to have weekly sessions like this going forward. So please, all of you out there who are still with us, send your thoughts, send your comments, send your ideas to any staff member. We want to make this a weekly format so we can bring this to the forefront and better educate and share ideas with everybody. So again, thank you so much. Be safe out there, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you, Bob.
Take care now, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you.